Welcome to the first review for Chapter 27. This is the first part of the deepening of European crisis. In this episode, we'll go over World War II. In the new curriculum for 2015-2016, this would be considered Historical Period 4. So, as we move through World War II in this chapter, some of this will be a little bit of a review for us, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Really, I want to start off with just saying, just 20 years after this so-called war to end all wars, Europe and the rest of the world found itself yet again at war. Why did this happen? Mainly the efforts that we discussed in chapters 25 and 26 failed miserably, and collective security that most nations thirsted for was unquenchable. The Treaty of Versailles in Article 231 resulted in resentment among German conservatives who were against the so-called dictated peace. This, if you remember, created the stab-in-the-back philosophy in Germany. Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations was, unfortunately, a miserable failure. The fact that the United States didn't join almost made a mockery out of the institution. The USSR was also not involved in the League of Nations. Now, ironically, Germany was allowed to enter the League of Nations in 1926 after the Locarno Treaty and in the spirit of Locarno. And basically, during the 1930s, the League stood by helplessly as Germany and Italy invaded neighboring nations and violated the dictating peace. If you recall, during what the textbook called the hopeful years, when many Europeans were looking again for any sign that there would be a lasting peace, many hopeful agreements were made. There was the Washington Naval Conference held in 1921 and 1922 by Warren G. Harding here in the United States, and it was an effort to get the most powerful nations of the world to begin disarming in order to maintain peace in the future. The goal was to prevent naval arms races that had been building even before the First World War, and many nations agreed and began cutting down their navy. Per the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was actually limited to a 100,000-man army and a puny Coast Guard-sized navy. Well, you know what? That didn't work out too well, and we'll see how that plays out. As part of this Washington Naval Conference, there was signed a treaty called the Five-Power Treaty, and it created a 5-5-3 battleship ratio between the United States, Britain, and Japan. However, smaller vessels were exempt from this agreement. But again, Britain and the United States would be allowed to have a larger majority of a naval fleet, whereas Japan was almost at the same size, but as you can see that they were deemed a little bit inferior, and obviously we'll see where that takes Japan here by the 1930s. Also, there was something called the Four-Power Treaty, which replaced the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902. It bound Britain, Japan, France, and the United States to preserve the status quo in the Pacific. And basically, that was a concession that was Japanese favorable, as we'll see playing out here. Many of the pacts of the hopeful years, flat out, they didn't last. The pact, which was supposed to make things better between France and Germany, failed, thanks to the failure of the Young Financial Plan after the failure, if you remember, of the United States stock market. The pact was really irrelevant once Hitler took power anyway. Additionally, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, where 62 nations signed a pact to make war illegal. Whoops, that didn't work either. Hitler just said later military exploits that he was carrying out were for defensive purposes, so he knew how to play the PR game. The inability of the world powers to unify and keep peace was made worse by their inability to achieve a plan to fix the worldwide Great Depression. Certain nations like the United States passed tariffs like the Hawley-Smoot tariff that debilitated other nations' economies, so they in return raised tariffs on U.S. products. The fact is that many of these agreements and the hopes for peace were interrupted, or interpreted, I should say, as signs of weakness, really by the militaristic and nationalistic powers of Italy, Japan, and of course Germany during the mid to late 1930s. The failure of democracies to really work together sent a strong signal to Hitler and the other aggressors that they lacked the will to do anything about future crises. Nazi Germany deliberately in the 1930s overthrew the Treaty of Versailles and the post-war settlement. Japan by 1931 invaded Manchuria, and the League of Nations did really, well, nothing. Italy will invade Ethiopia by 1935 and kill some 500,000 Ethiopians in comparison to the only 5,000 Italians that perished. And why this happened? Once again, the League stood idly by. Now, there was a power vacuum. We've talked about this term in class from time to time, and this was the case in the 1930s. Really, Britain and France, at the point after the war, they were willing to basically do anything that they could to possibly avoid another world war. The Soviet Union, which we know was communist and kind of the outcast of Europe, they were at the point where they were upset because they weren't even invited to most of the conferences where peace was even discussed. They weren't even recognized in most cases. After the war, the United States was kind of back to its old tricks. The United States was disillusioned with really its flirtation as a world power pre and during the First World War. So what the United States does is they go back to their traditional policy of being neutral and isolationist. And in terms of foreign policy, they chose to ignore what was going on in Europe, except in beneficial economic endeavors in which they could profit from. Eastern European states went back to their old traditions. They remained too weak politically and economically as a result of the Depression following World War I. So what they'll do is they'll go back to what they're always good at, and that is turning to rather authoritarian governments, because traditionally that's what they always did. Now, Nazi Germany would use this void of power and unity, and lack thereof, I should say, to revive themselves economically and militarily. They desired Lebensraum, land for expansion, and a reversal of their fortunes at the hand of the Treaty of Versailles and Article 231. Also, additionally, in the book, they mentioned, obviously, we've talked a lot about Hitler, totalitarianism. But what was the role of Hitler here in bringing about the Second World War? Well, Hitler had this idea of building this great German civilization. Part of it was to restore their empire prior to World War I, but also making it even more, just powerful overall. And it was based on the following concepts. And many of these concepts we've mentioned that he wrote about. He outlined this in his book, Mein Kampf. The first ideal was the Aryan race. It was a superior race, according to Adolf Hitler, especially in comparison to what he deemed inferior Jews and Slavic peoples. Lebensraum was, acquiring living space in the East and South. And basically, Lebensraum was kind of this notion that power for a nation depended on the amount of land that they occupied, or a land that a nation occupied. And really, his Darwinistic views made him eager to take over new lands. But more importantly, take lands back, as I mentioned earlier, that had been taken from Germany as a result of Article 231. And we'll see this play out, where the Polish corridor, which split Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, the whole state of Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, we've talked about this stuff, Rhineland, which was given to France, the Saar. So that's going to be a big part of Lebensraum, not only expanding further, but also taking back what he believed was rightfully Germany's. Also, again, going back to the Aryanism and the racism, Slavic people, according to Adolf Hitler, were inferior, and they would be used for slave labor. Additionally, conquests of Eastern Europe and Russia were very paramount to Hitler's desires. The Russian Revolution, in Hitler's view, was the green light that he needed to take over Russia, according to him. He believed they were inferior. He would have the German peasants dominate Russia once he conquered it. And in many eyes, this goal of conquest was alive and well in Germany even before World War I, where they had thought about and contemplated taking Russia out of the war first. Now, the belief that only he could create the Aryan racial empire was also pretty paramount. Again, this empire would be complete with slave labor, and unfortunately, the belief that he would exterminate of what he deemed undesirable people to create the Thousand-Year Reich. And obviously, with that extermination would be Jews, among others. And we'll get to that in 27.2. And again, he was an impatient man. He wanted to do this now. He wanted to do it immediately, not gradually. So that was Hitler's role in bringing about the development of the process that would become World War II. Now, we mentioned a diplomatic revolution earlier in the year. If you remember, it happened prior to the 7 Years' War, and it involved a big deal where you had a change of alliances. And it was one where France and Austria actually started to work together, and Prussia, which would become Germany, would start working with Britain, and again, you had Frederick the Great working with England, and obviously the fate of France was on the poor side of history with the initial diplomatic revolution. While your textbook talks about this new diplomatic revolution from 1933 to 1936. So let's kind of delve into that and figure out what that's all about. Now again, when Hitler came to power as chancellor in 1933, Germany really seemed weak. Again, even when Hitler became chancellor, a lot of Germans and a lot of obviously foreigners who were watching what was going on with this Nazi nationalist party, they had a tough time taking Hitler serious. I mean, come on, look at his mustache, all right? The Rhineland was still demilitarized in the west along the border of France, and they felt really strongly that that was going to keep peace. The French also installed something called the Maginot Line to create an impenetrable zone against future German aggression. And you can see this line on the border between France and Germany. They thought there's no way that Germany would try to penetrate this Maginot Line. We'll get into that in a little bit. But it made France probably have a false sense of security against future aggression. In the eastern countries, as you read in the last chapter, a lot of those new countries, Poland and Czechoslovakia, they had made defensive alliances with France. So, people thought that there was a check in power of Germany that would kind of thwart any possible future aggression by Germany. So, additionally, Germany's military was limited, as we said, by the Treaty of Versailles, with no air force, limited naval forces, and again, 100,000 men. But Germany, let's face it, Germany did have some, it had some advantages. Okay, and I want to talk about those. Germany really was going to exploit, and Hitler was going to exploit these advantages to maximum capacity. And the first advantage would be that Germany was the second most popular country, and really does have a strong industrial capacity with factories, mills. Before World War I, Germany was one of the leaders, surpassed most of the continental, and even in some cases surpassed Britain in industrial capacity. So if they could just get those factories going again, a lot of people felt strongly that they would have a pretty quick economic recovery. Additionally, Britain and France were worn out, as we've said, and dismayed by the cost of World War I, and were really eager to avoid another war at all costs. So Hitler's plan, we talked about Hitler's role, his vision. Hitler's plan to kind of make his vision come through and come true was to ignore or scrap the Treaty of Versailles, which was a very, very popular ideal in Germany. He wanted to restore Germany's strength, and he would do that through rebuilding the army. I mean, he created a huge force and went from spending about 1 billion Reichsmarks in 1933 to 30 billion by 1939 when he invaded Poland. So, roughly, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of his army? The German army went from about 550,000 men in 1935 to over 4.5 million in 1939 at the beginning stages of the Second World War. So, what did he do? How did he prepare for war and conquest? He and his commanders devised new plans of attacks so they could avoid the stalemate of World War I and the infamous trenches. We'll get into Blitzkrieg and what those tactics were here. But this was a premeditated strike. Another thing that Hitler did very well, actually, was he posed initially as a man of peace. He kind of sold himself, and his public image was that he was a guy that wanted peace, and he only wanted Germany to be treated fairly. And his bold move to pull Germany from the League of Nations and Geneva, where there was a disarmament conference going on, was done to domestically create the image that he was creating a situation where Germany was no longer being bullied by the other European powers. And again, that was a really, really popular sell back in Germany. Now, Hitler could have stopped at any point between 1933 and 1936 when he was violating the Treaty of Versailles. But, he could have stopped, or he could have been stopped, if you know what I mean. Another country like Britain and France could have come in and, ended it and said, hey, we're not going to put up with this. But they did nothing. And Germany and Hitler, when they saw the lack of response to everything they were doing between 33 and 36, it gave them intestinal fortitude, and it encouraged them to be even bolder. So, In terms of if you look here at a timeline of events, we go from Germany withdrawing from the Geneva Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations in 33 when Hitler became chancellor. 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. Nothing, no response. Hitler announced German military rearmament. I mean, he came out and said he was going to do it. Nobody did anything. October 1936, Hitler and Mussolini formed what's known as the Berlin-Rome or Rome-Berlin axis in the fascist turn, which basically made them, allies, and they collectively, they cooperatively intervened in Spain on the side of General Franco in the Spanish Civil War against, you guessed it, the Russians, who were supporting the communist forces. In November of 36, there was an alliance. We already mentioned that one. The March of 1936, Hitler went in and he took the Rhineland. And it was kind of on at that point. Now, again, the European and world powers had plenty of time to react. But what did they do? Nothing. Now, let's talk about why. Why did these Western democracies fail to do anything? Well, again, we've talked about this. Fear of another war. There were still memories that haunted people and how horrific the First World War was. You got to be aware of this. This stuff could happen in the future. When you lose your will to fight, that's when bullies, non-trustworthy countries and leaders do things. They test you. So they wanted to focus on domestic problems. The Western nations wanted to focus on their domestic problems and the economic crisis that was, as we mentioned, the Great Depression. They were preoccupied flat out with their own problems. They didn't want to get involved in this other stuff that was going on in countries that they really didn't think about or care about. There were cutbacks in military spending. As we've already said, that was kind of the trend, the Treaty of Locarno, the Spirit of Locarno, the Washington Naval Conference. But, really the other thing was cut back on military spending because they needed to spend money on their own countries due to the Depression. So these cuts were due to both the Spirit of Locarno, but also to deal with the economic crises that most of these countries were dealing with. And again, this was making them weak militarily. Now, Nazi Germany would provide protection against Soviet communism. There was fear of Bolshevism and communism, as we mentioned, in all the countries in the West. And they thought that, Nazi Germany, their agenda was beating up communism. So they thought, hey, these guys might be an excellent ally in our crusade against Bolshevism and the spread of communism. So that actually played into Hitler and Nazi Germany's favor. Additionally, there was a notion of pacifism. It was a movement relating to the horrific memories of World War I, and we mentioned this, but governments were reluctant to risk any type of war with Germany. In fact, by the mid-30s, many in Britain believed that Germany had been they became sympathetic with Germany, that they had been unfairly treated and punished by the Versailles Treaty. And again, I've already mentioned this, because Hitler sold himself as this, there was a belief that Hitler was not unreasonable and was peaceful. Whoops-a-daisy. Big misjudgment there. But by the end of 1936, Germany was strong. Western powers looked weak and fearful, and so Hitler prepared for war. Remember, the German rearmament was crucial to Germany's economic recovery from the Depression and independence from the Treaty of Versailles. So, we talked about 33 to 37. Let's talk about the initial path to war. By 1937, Hitler holds secret meetings with his generals. His ultimate goal was the conquest of living space, or Lebensraum, in the East. They realized, as they talked about this, that this might lead to war with Britain and France. So the first goal was to deal with Austria and Czechoslovakia. And in March of 1939, what we saw, or what the world saw, was the Anschluss. Okay? And now the Anschluss was where Germany annexes Austria. Okay? Remember, Austria was made small after the breakup of Austria-Hungary, after the Treaty of Versailles. And, the threat of Germany's military might forced. Remember also, a lot of you know this, that Hitler was initially Austrian, okay? So Hitler has this force. He's been rearming, and he kind of basically says, hey, I'm going to take you over. Remember Kleindeutsch, Große Deutsch? Well, this is a chance for Germany to be big Germany, as we mentioned, going all the way back to holy cow, like the 1600s that this was discussed, but really after the French Revolution. And so a lot of Germans were kind of excited about this. And the threat of Germany's military might force the Austrian Chancellor to resign. So the Austrian Nazi Party took control. And when the Austrian Nazi Party, again, if you've seen The Sound of Music, this is in there, man. This is big time stuff. If you haven't seen The Sound of Music. It might be that you are a communist or a Nazi, and you need to kind of educate yourself and culture yourself and watch that. But great music, great story, especially if you know your history. But the Austrian Nazi Party in turn took control and requested, hey, German Nazi Party, please come in, annex us, make us part of your empire. So Große Deutsch was realized, and Germany marched in and took Austria, and wait for it, without firing a single shot. So here's an image of them marching in, and again, these are all good Nazis, and even if they aren't good Nazis, this is what bad Nazis do too, because if you're not a Nazi, you do this or you get shot. So this is the German Auschwitz, and you see, interpreting this, putting one more brick, you got Germany, you got Austria, put that in there, Große Deutsch, isn't it? Isn't it just great, guys? Anyway, I'm just kidding, it's not great. It's Hitler. So, but this was the Anschluss. And what was the reaction to the Anschluss? Well, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain rejected joining an alliance with France and Russia to oppose Germany's invasion. There was talk, hey guys, maybe we should get together and do something about this. Now, Neville Chamberlain says, no, we don't want to do this. He believed it would be too aggressive, and again, it might destroy future attempts to negotiate some kind of peace with Hitler. That's probably the first mistake. But they did nothing, and Hitler turned his eyes eastward once again to Czechoslovakia. Okay, now we mentioned this earlier in chapter 26, I believe it was, but you had this place in Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland, and you can see it here. I'll play with my new tool here. All right, you can see it right here, and these white parts, okay, these were Austrian, former lands of Austria, but they were actually parts of Germany. And when the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations made Czechoslovakia, they actually took these white areas, which were initially part of Germany, so there were Germans living there. They made those people live in Czechoslovakia. Again, it's kind of like when Poland was partitioned in the 18th century. You know, you were still Polish, but you were living in Russia, man, or you were living in Prussia, or you were living under basically the occupation of the Austrians. And so a lot of Germans found themselves, basically at the mercy of the Czech government, as I said. So the area of northwestern Czechoslovakia, which had a large population of ethnic Germans. And again, Czechoslovakia had been created under the 14 points notion of self-determination and a part of the Treaty of Versailles. So it took the German land as part of forming this modern nation, as I've repeated about 80 times. But I just want to make sure you get what's going on here. So by September of 1938, using the language of the Treaty of Versailles and national, this is important, national self-determination, Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland be allowed to leave Czechoslovakia and join Germany, since those people were Germans. And again, many of them, the Germans did want to be back with Germany. So he said national self-determination. He threw those words back, very clever, in the face of the League of Nations. Now, interestingly enough, Czechoslovakia refuses on the fact that it had well-defended borders. It also had an alliance, as we mentioned, with France. It was a member of the Little Entente. So it seemed like World War right here was likely. What to do? What to do? So this leads to something called the Munich Conference. Again, September 29th, 1938. And the issue and tension over the Sudetenland was to be resolved arbitrarily or by a third party. And this was the leadership, once again, of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Now, the conference in Munich was attended by Britain, Germany, France, and Italy. Even Mussolini was allowed to go there. However, ironically, Czechoslovakia, and of course Russia, they're not going to invite Russia, but the Czechs aren't even allowed to attend this meeting, which is going to determine their fate. How messed up is that? But that's the way it was, all right? No respect for them. And it was at this conference that Neville Chamberlain adopts his policy of appeasement. And you need to know that. Appeasement is a huge term for Chapter 27 and a huge term on the AP exam for World War II and causes leading up to it. Basically, appeasement is making concessions to an aggressor in order to achieve peace. Give them what they want so we can have peace, avoid war. And the solution to the problem, what Neville Chamberlain and the people agreed was, Czechoslovakia would give away the Sudetenland, just give it to Germany, in return for the guaranteed independence of Czechoslovakia. Now the Czechs are really upset. They're disappointed because, first of all, they're not even allowed to attend the meeting, but the fate of their country is basically dependent on all the other nations and what they want. Nothing to do with what they want, which, where's the self-determination here, boys? The Brits and the French simply told the Czech government, hey, if you don't comply with this, you're not going to get any military support from us. We're not going to back you at all. So it's you versus Hitler. Good luck. And basically Hitler says, hey, no, this is a good agreement. I promise, Hitler promises, he will make no more territorial demands in Europe. Now, Chamberlain, ironically, returns to Britain, a hero, claiming, he reads a speech in front of everybody saying, I have a message signed right here by Heil Hitler. And again, here it is, right here. I have a message here from Heil Hitler that there will be peace in our time. He will not wage war. What a farce. What a farce. So, basically Hitler interprets the agreement at Munich. One of the things I've noticed in this podcast, or whatever you want to call it, is I say basically a lot, so I apologize for that ahead of time. But Hitler views the agreement at Munich as an indicator that Britain and France are weaker than he even thought, that they really would not fight. So Hitler implements secret plans to take all of the Czech lands. And in March of 1939, Hitler arrives in Prague and announces that all Czech lands would join the Nazi Reich. And, so again, Germany invades the rest of Czechoslovakia by March of 1939. Hitler had double-crossed Chamberlain. Czechoslovakia, they didn't resist invasion. What could they do? In one end, they're like, hey, Britain and France, good job, way to go. And here we go. So in the space of a year, Hitler had taken both Austria and Czechoslovakia, again, without firing a single shot. That's the climate. So we got Poland is on Hitler's radar next. Hitler's takeover of Czechoslovakia reveals, obviously, to the rest of the world that, hey, this guy does not tell the truth. He's a liar. And that Western democracies were wrong to have attempted to deal with him diplomatically. And 1 week after taking Czechoslovakia, Hitler demands the Baltic port city of Danzig. Now, you'll recall, we learned about this. This was located in that infamous Polish corridor that had separated East Prussia from Germany. And as he had done with the Sudetenland, Hitler uses the alleged poor treatment of ethnic Germans in Poland, that they were getting bullied in that Polish corridor by Polacks. And so he uses this, that these people were being poorly treated, there's your self-determination again as well, as a pretext for his demand that Germany takes this back. Chamberlain threatens that if Germany attacks Poland, Britain would fight a war to protect Poland. But if you're Hitler, you're thinking, okay, whatever, buddy. I duped you twice already. So Britain signs a security treaty with Poland, pledging to defend them if they are attacked. And Hitler is, at this point, seeking to avoid a two-front war against France and Britain. In the West, and he kind of knows also, we've talked about Lebensraum, his intentions with Russia in the East. So, Germany tried to do that in World War I. It didn't work out too well. So, basically at this point, Britain and France know this too. So they start negotiating with the Soviet Union and Stalin to try to form some kind of alliance. But if you remember, these powers and the United States weren't too kind to the Soviet Union early on. And it's just kind of interesting what happens here. But Stalin decides he's gonna make a treaty with Hitler. So we have the German and Soviet non-aggression pact. Got to know it on the test. August of 1939. And here it is. There's Joseph Stalin chilling in the back. This is Russian diplomat Molotov signing the document. There's some good cartoons here with Hitler and Stalin being married. And it says, how long will the honeymoon last? Well, we'll learn that. Stay tuned. But it's basically an assurance that by Hitler, he seeks assurance that Russia would not attack Germany if he invades Poland. Now, it's also a guarantee of non-aggression that this would allow Germany to only fight that one front war that they were wanting to fight against France and Britain. So, really, when this was signed, the world was shocked at that arch enemies, Hitler and Stalin. I mean, Germany and in Russia, quite honestly, Nazis and communists hate each other. Nobody could figure out why would they make such an agreement. But these are two of the most evil men in history, guys. So it shouldn't have come as too big of a shock. So here are the provisions of the treaty. A 10-year non-aggression pact between Germany and Russia, where they wouldn't attack one another. It's kind of like when you're playing Risk. Hey, I won't attack you for 5 turns. So let's go out and let's take our buddy out here. Let's teach him a lesson or two. So privately in the agreement, Germany and Russia decided that they would both invade Poland and split the country in half. And again, it's called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Treaty. You don't need to know that, but it kind of makes sense why Molotov's in that picture up above. So Stalin would also get the Baltic states of Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. And France and Britain, offered Stalin military risk without gain. They said, the alliance that Britain and France offered him, it would have been fighting involved. Hitler offered him territorial gain without risk. They weren't really worried about Poland. So that's one of the reasons why Stalin took this. We got more cartoons here. You never know when they're going to be on a DBQ. But this is little Goldilocks Riding Hood, and she goes in and she sees Nazi Germany with the big bad wolf, and there's the symbolic Russian bear there, Soviet Russia, and she is played by Poland here. She's shocked. Poland was shocked, no doubt about it. And here's another one that I've seen on the AP exam in the past. And obviously you have Hitler, and you have Stalin, and you have a Pole there that they're stepping on their back. So Germany invaded Poland September 1st, 1939. And this is, you got to know, this marks the beginning. This is why it's significant, the beginning of World War II. Again, September 3rd, Britain and France, they officially declare war on Germany. You can kind of see there's the German invasion of Poland. Sorry, got to get back to that slide. And there's the headlines of the day. Now, Germany, we talked about those generals, trying to avoid getting bogged down in the trenches. So what they did was they used and devised a new plan of attack. And it's called Blitzkrieg. It means lightning war. That's what they unleashed on Poland. This new type of warfare the goal was to quickly defeat an enemy by poking a hole in an enemy line and cutting off front lines from the rear, thus surrounding the army. They used coordinated attacks on one part of the enemy line, and they used it with the Air Force, airstrikes. Then the tanks and mobilized artillery would roll in, quick, swift, get it done before they even know what's going on. And again, this was the strategy that they came up with to avoid trench warfare that had bogged all the powers down in the First World War. The Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force, you need to know that. Again, they would come in and they'd bomb the heck out of the enemy, and then these swift panzer divisions, which these panzer divisions were revolutionary. They had 300 tanks, followed by mechanized infantry that were carried on armored trucks and vehicles on motorcycles. I mean, they were quick. As soon as it's kind of like shock and awe, if you remember, in the Iraq War, but you guys were probably too young to remember that. But again, it's to shock the enemy and take them entirely out before they could really mount a response. Poland was defeated in less than a month. The Germans at this point, they looked just utterly unstoppable. Okay, and they did exactly what they promised. They partitioned Poland. They divided it up between Germany and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union also attacked from the east. Stalin also in 1939 invaded Finland. So, just as the deal said, the USSR annexed Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and that was to create a buffer zone against Germany. Again, Stalin ultimately believed that Hitler and Germany would one day invade Russia. And again, all you had to do is read Mein Kampf, and this is what this guy was talking about. So this is what was discussed in your book under Victory and Stalemate, the subheading. So that's Blitzkrieg. Okay, there's also something called Sitzkrieg, and it means phony war. And I've seen this on the AP exam. So basically what you have is after Poland was invaded, there was a 7-month lull where really, nothing was going on. This is symbolic. And this German soldier, what's he doing? He's like picking daisies or dandelions, and there wasn't much going on. So it's kind of weird because all the powers declared war, but then nothing happened. So it caused some people to say that this World War, Second World War, was a myth. It wasn't going to happen. And the world kind of waits to see where Hitler might strike next. And I think everybody was hoping maybe he's done. Well, not the case. Okay. So anyway, we got to turn our eyes to the Pacific, okay? And we've concentrated on Germany and Europe up to this point, but let's not forget the trials and tribulations that were occurring in the Far East and in Asia. And the war in Asia started with the lofty ambitions of the imperial power of Japan. Now remember, Japan went from samurai swords and being a feudal society when U.S. Commodore Perry forced them to open up trade with the United States in 1854. And again, to less than 50 years later, samurai swords, 50 years later, whipping up and embarrassing the massive Russian army in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And that always floors me, that in less than 50 years, you could go from a feudal society to an industrial power that's able to take out one of the most powerful countries, or at least the biggest armies in Europe. So just, again, miraculous. It's a testament to the Japanese ingenuity and their willpower. Now, additionally, they had taken many of Germany's eastern and Pacific islands and their colonies, if you remember, as a result of the mandate system of World War I. So they became a veritable force, an empire, if you will. So it's kind of interesting. By the 30s, internal dissension arose in Japan. Again, just like what we talked about in France, in Germany, in Russia, in all of these countries. Heck, there was even unrest in the 30s dealing with the Great Depression right here in the United States. What was the problem? Why was there so much internal dissension? Look, they were overpopulated. They had gone from 30 million people between 1870 to 1880 to 80 million people by 1937. So you had this huge population explosion. And they really struggled to feed these people. There was just too many people. It's a small island country. And so they struggled to acquire food. And they also struggled to acquire and pay for industrial raw materials for heavy industry. This island nation was extremely dependent on foreign nations for all the raw materials that they needed to produce their weapons, and not just weapons, but just their daily uses, industrial might for heavy industry. However, as the rest of the world entered the Great Depression, Japan found that the protective tariffs that a lot of the nations were passing really devastated their ability to acquire any raw materials. So politically, Japan had gone from a government dominated by an emperor to a political democracy, or almost like a constitutional monarchy, if you will, with an emperor, with mass political parties and suffrage by 1924. They were westernizing, okay? But this economic crisis that we had mentioned, the Great Depression and the interwar years, Japan created or had a lot of social unrest. That's the situation that was created by the Depression. Again, as I said, a lot like we talked about with the Western nations in Europe. And just like we saw in Germany, just like we see in Italy, you have right-wing, extreme right-wing patriotic societies allying themselves with the Army and the Navy to push a policy of expansion at the expense of nations that they deemed inferior. And mainly these inferior nations that they set their sights on were China and the Soviet Union. And they kind of had their own Lebensraum, if you will. I don't know how you'd pronounce that in Japanese. I'm not even going to go there. But their goal ultimately was to be self-sufficient. They needed to acquire lands that they didn't need to depend on the United States and other powers for raw materials, as I mentioned earlier. So thus they beefed up their military, modernized both their armies and navies by the early 1930s. Now, Japanese goals in the East, by 1931, they seized Manchuria. Again, if you look up here, Manchuria, right here. Okay, they seize the northeastern Chinese region, again, because it has a lot of natural resources. Okay, so, but League of Nations condemns the invasions, but does little by the way of its sanctions. They hardly put sanctions on the country. And, even though, they kind of slapped them on the wrist, Japan was mad, and they said, you know what, we're getting out of this. So they pull out of the League of Nations, again, making the League of Nations even weaker. So I want to talk about some other, things here. The Chinese, this is on the test, the Chinese nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, originally sought to appease, just like Neville Chamberlain did, tried to appease Tokyo by allowing them to administer control over some of the areas in Manchuria and North China. However, appeasement didn't work in Asia any better than it worked in Europe. And, eventually there's going to be a clash. And this clash happened in 1937. The Japanese launched an offensive which allowed them to capture the capital of China, Nanking, as it was pronounced back then. It's kind of interesting, but the textbook breezes over this invasion. However, I just want to kind of throw it out there that, so much attention is paid to Stalin and the evil ways of Hitler. I just want you to kind of know this was pretty nasty as well. A lot of people call this invasion the Rape of Nanking. All right, it was an episode consisting of mass murder and mass rape by Japanese troops against the Chinese residents of Nanking. Some of the stories are so horrible, I wouldn't even begin to talk about them here. But if you're interested in this and you're curious, heck, you can look it up quickly on the internet, or there are books about this. But it's just kind of a fascinating thing, and it's just interesting that some people just kind of breeze over it like nothing happened. The massacre occurred over a 6-week period, starting from December 13th, 1937, which was the day the Japanese captured the capital. During this period, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army is estimated that they killed anywhere between 40,000 to 300,000 Chinese, not military combat, but civilians, people that were disarmed, and perpetrated widespread rape and looting. Now, the Japanese desired a coalition with China to create a new order in East Asia with Japan, Manchuria, and China, which they would altogether seize Soviet Siberia and its natural resources. Their goal, kind of ironically, was kind of a Monroe Doctrine for Asia. They wanted to make that their sphere of influence. But Chiang Kai-shek refused to surrender and join the Japanese, and that's one of the reasons why they took the matters into their own hand. So, again, into the late 30s, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, they start cooperating with one another. Hitler sees them as an ally, potentially. And their mutual goal was that they would eventually launch an assault simultaneously against the Soviet Union and divide up their natural resources. But it was kind of interesting. The Non-Aggression Pact in 1939 it caught the Japanese by surprise, and really forced them to sit back and kind of reevaluate their long-term goals. They knew they couldn't defeat Stalinist Russia alone. Again, after Stalin's 5-year industrial plans, it wasn't the same Russia that they had defeated in the Russo-Japanese War. They were a lot stronger. Plus, the USSR had the advantages of a lot more natural resources and raw materials that they needed for a heavy industrial war. So what they did, in turn, is they turned their attention to Southeast Asia and the oil of the Dutch East Indies. All right, and they knew that if they launched attacks southward, they'd risk war with European colonial powers, mainly Britain, France, and they also knew that they would be contesting the United States. So by 1941, when the Japanese took control over South Vietnam, what the United States and FDR did was they responded by cutting off sales of scrap iron, vital scrap iron that the Japanese needed for industrial products. And there was an oil embargo. They just stopped giving oil or trading oil to Japan. And Japan responded. That was their response. It was a preemptive strike that would limit America's ability to respond to future Japanese expansion. And you guys probably already know what I'm talking about there. And it's Pearl Harbor, but we'll get to that here shortly. Now, once Britain and France declared war, and after Hitler invaded Poland, Hitler believed that he had everything under control. He's like, I got this, guys. All right. And he knew Britain and France would expect the same old, same old. In other words, he thought that they would be hell-bent, that there would be a war of attrition, like World War I, that they would implement some kind of economic blockade, and that there would still be a hesitation for them to go on the offensive. And quite frankly, he was right. As I mentioned earlier, France had built those series of concrete steel fortifications with heavily armed artillery along the border of France and Germany. Again, they called it the Maginot Line. So France was really content that, okay, there's a war, we've declared war, we're just going to sit back and fight a defensive war. So Hitler didn't pull any punches. He waited and in 1940 he goes back on the offensive, and in April he invades Denmark and Norway. All right, and when he invades uh, Denmark, and Norway, all hell breaks loose. All right. By May, he goes after the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They fall to Germany. I mean, it's just like a domino effect. I mean, people are falling to the Germans left and right. In Asia, Asia's fallen to the Japanese left and right. Remember, a lot of these countries had been disarming and didn't want to admit the fact that there could be another big war. So, just the Netherlands succumbed to the Blitzkrieg in 5 days. Then the Nazis went into Belgium as if they were going to move into France, just like they did in World War I with the Schlieffen Plan and the Franco-Prussian War. However, it was a trick. The Germans' main offensive would come through Luxembourg and the Ardennes forests, a move that really caught France by surprise. And you know what they did? They went right around the Maginot Line. All that money the French spent on the Maginot Line, and the Germans didn't even play with it. So the main Belgian forces surrendered, while the rest of France and British forces were trapped. They were blitzkrieged and trapped at Dunkirk. And you can kind of see live action footage. The red is obviously the Nazis. There's a last-ditch attempt there by the Allies to do something, but it was of no use. And again, at Dunkirk, thousands of French and British soldiers were trapped on the beaches. They were going to get slaughtered, or the war could have been over right there. If the Germans came in for the kill, they would either slaughter them, or the French and the British would have to surrender right there. But thousands were rescued by an armada of British vessels. A lot of them, civilian vessels that carried them to safety. And really, this is an instrumental, very, very significant event in history, because it really saves the world and democracy from total annihilation right then and there in 1940. It's kind of interesting because you see Churchill up above. He says, "We must be careful not to assign this deliverance from Dunkirk the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." He's basically saying, don't celebrate this when we're still on the run. And here's another example of this. British troops wading out to the vessels while they're under fire, evacuating Dunkirk. Not going any better. That was May. By June 5th, early June, the Germans continued their assault on France, this time in southern France. And on June 10th, Mussolini, believing the war was over and wanted in on the on land and at the expense of France, he invaded also from the south. So France surrendered on June 22nd, 1940. And if you look here are the German troops coming in through the Arc de Triomphe. Here's Hitler and his cronies chilling, taking a tour through Paris. And also here's a Frenchman who is just devastated, and he's crying as he sees Nazis strolling down the street. So, what happened in France during the war after they surrendered? You need to know this. There's a puppet government that is created. It's called the Vichy French, or Vichy France. Hitler didn't want to waste time subduing all of France, so there's a puppet government that he created in southern France, and it was led by Marshal Henri Philippe Pétain. He was put in charge. He'll later be executed by the French government for treason, but he was a war hero of the French at the Battle of Verdun, but he was a member of the fascists. Even in France, they had extreme right-wing conservative forces, just like they did in a lot of these countries, that thought that the country should go in a different route. And, the Vichy French eventually was taken over completely by Germany later in the war because they weren't able to really keep the peace. In fact, an example of that is Charles de Gaulle, General Charles de Gaulle, led a movement called the Free French. And these are French officials who fled to Britain during France's fall. And, they would do what they could to move the resistance movement in France against the Germans, okay? So the significance at this point is Germany was in control right here after the fall of France of all of Western and Central Europe. And the last power standing in Hitler's way was, you guessed it, Great Britain. It was at this point also that the Tripartite Pact was signed in 1940, and Japan was added to that Rome-Berlin axis for mutual defense and support. And again, you think about it, you wake up and you read that in the paper. You guys think the world's messed up today? Holy cow, imminent doom everywhere. It seemed that the democracy and free people everywhere were in harm's way. Now, Britain is alone. We said this is a problem. people in Britain knew it as well. So these German victories and success led to a change in the government in England. Yeah, as we know, appeasement failed. So they got rid of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. In fact, he was basically forced to resign in May of 1940, and his replacement was none other than Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had made a name for himself throughout the 30s, while everybody was saying, no, we don't want to fight, no. You know, he was saying, no, you're going to have to fight this guy. He was against appeasement. He was ahead of his time. A lot of people dissed him and said, you know what, all you're doing is trying to start a war. You're somebody that's trying to do this to achieve political power. He said, you got to stand up to these guys. He stand up to Hitler throughout the 30s. He said it. He was an inspiring leader, great speaker. Coincidentally, he's one of my heroes. I got to be honest with you. I'm not going to go too far into that. But this was Winston Churchill, and it's kind of interesting, in the darkest hour in modern history, that a great leader like this comes up and kind of, he has it. He knows what to do. But he refused to make any kind of deal ever with Hitler, and he refused to compromise. And Hitler was kind of disappointed. He thought new leadership, this was a chance to kind of make a deal. And one of the first things that Churchill says when he comes in is, this is one of the best quotes: "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We will never surrender." And, and again, you think about these words. They're not just words. They're reality. Because everybody knows what's coming. The Nazis are coming, and hell's coming with them. And Churchill didn't make any bones about it. He told the people flat out, "This is going to be ugly, but we will persevere." And again, there's no mistake. Hitler wants to take out Britain, but he knew. He studied AP Euro. He studied history. He knew about Philip II. He knew about Napoleon. He knew that invasions of England could make or break ambitious leaders. In terms of modern warfare, he knew it would only work if he controlled the air lanes. Okay, so by August of 1940, the Battle of Britain, one of the most crucial and critical battles of the war, is underway, and it was Hitler's Air Force against Britain. Again, Hitler called this Operation Sea Lion. And again, you had the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force, led by Hitler's crony Hermann Göring, launched offensive airstrikes against British air and naval bases, harbors, communication centers, and war industrial complex, aka factories. And the Brits fought back valiantly with the RAF, or the British Royal Air Force, the Royal Air Force. You need to know that. And additionally, the British Ultra Intelligence Operation had, right before the battle broke out, broken German codes and had given the RAF information about specific targets that the Germans were attacking. And they were also aided by the invention of radar, which only they enjoyed at this point, to prepare for attacks before they occurred. So they had radar, and the Germans didn't know, why aren't we killing as many people? Well, people were able to go underground. They knew these attacks were coming before they actually did. So the RAF, I need you to know, it still had suffered heavy casualties, but they were really successful in frustrating Hitler's Luftwaffe. And by September of 1940, Hitler changed his plan of attack. Instead of attacking military and industrial targets, he started bombing flat out the cities. He went right after the people. And this was a really, really big mistake because, again, the radar, the people were able to go underground. They went into the subway lines, and their houses were being blown up, but they weren't dying because they were underground. And again, this is a crucial mistake by Hitler because what ends up happening is the industrial centers, a lot of the factories, they're still running, so they're able to replenish the Royal Air Force's numbers. And so the Battle of Britain fails for the Nazis by the end of September of 1940, and the invasion was postponed. Okay, Germany lost about 2,430 planes, and the Royal Air Force lost about 900. The Blitz continues until May of 1941, but the significance of this battle is huge. Hitler now had to guard against a future two-front war. And just so you know, D-Day in 1944, it's a-coming. Guess where it's going to be launched from? Britain. Another one of I keep calling him Hitler, I'm sorry. Another one of Churchill's famous quotes: "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." As you can tell, Huge, huge Churchill fan. But of course, the World War II continues. Again, the problems for Britain. Once Operation Sea Lion and the invasion of Britain failed, Hitler kind of reprogrammed his plan, and he turned to another strategy. He said if he couldn't take England at home, he would get them through other venues. So he turned his efforts towards the Mediterranean, Egypt, and the Suez Canal. Now, his objective was to close the Mediterranean to where British shipping would be totally shut off. He could totally keep oil coming from Africa and coming from the Middle East through the Suez. He could cut off their shipping, and they would have no oil, and they would be brought to their knees. Now, initially, he left the Italians and Mussolini to do these jobs, but they were quickly routed, the Italians were. And so then he half-heartedly sent German troops to invade North Africa in an attempt to drive them out. Now, I say half-heartedly because, again, he was already planning his invasion of Russia. He had too much going on, guys. And again, Hitler's ace in this hole would be Erwin Rommel, who was the leader of the German Afrika Korps, which it was called. And Erwin Rommel had the nickname of the Desert Fox. Now, he was up against Bernard Montgomery, who was the leader of the British forces in North Africa, and they were known as the Desert Rats. And Montgomery defeats Rommel, and it's kind of an interesting story. This is the Battle of El Alamein. I'll talk about it here in a little bit, but it's kind of interesting. Rommel gets sick, has to fly back home to Germany for recovery, and that's when the battle happens. And again, we know that the Brits had the code, so what better time to attack when their fearless leader is not there? It's going to be kind of interesting that at D-Day, Rommel was put in charge of D-Day. I'll get into that in a little bit. And once again, Rommel wasn't there on June 6th. Where was he? He had flown home to celebrate his wife's birthday. What a good husband. But again, that's when the attack was launched. That was probably a little bit more coincidental, but he wasn't there. So needless to say, also by 1942, the Americans enter the equation with General Patton storming across North Africa in the United States Operation Torch. Now, as I mentioned just a second ago, Hitler all along had planned on invading Russia to fulfill his dream of Lebensraum, living space, in the East at the expense of the Bolshevik, what he deemed the Bolshevik and Jewish leadership of the Soviet Union, who he deemed inferior. Now, this is probably, you might want to write this, Hitler's biggest blunder. And there's the stab in the back. Forgive me, comrade, but it seemed such a good opportunity. But the code name of this invasion of the Soviet Union was Operation Barbarossa, okay? And Hitler actually planned to invade the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941. And again, as I said, but he had to bail out Mussolini and the Italians out of the mess that they had gotten themselves into in the Balkans and in Africa. So it forced a delay. And in 1941, the Nazis go ahead. They seize Yugoslavia. They seize Greece. And they think they got everything in order there. So on June 22nd, 1941, the Nazis go ahead and they attack the Soviet Union. And, the Russians, they use what they always use, the scorched earth policy. In other words, they destroy anything of value as they withdraw to deprive the German army of any other resources, anything of use. You remember how vast Russia is. So, thousands of towns in the USSR are destroyed. And basically the goal is lure the Germans in, overextend themselves, let them overextend themselves, and then in the vastness of Russia, wait for Old Man Winter. And it's exactly the same thing that they did to Napoleon in his invasion in and around 1812. So by winter, Germans were at the gates of Moscow while laying siege to Leningrad or St. Petersburg. And, those last 2 years, but it looks like the Germans are in a good state. And it's at this time, in August of 1941, that Churchill and U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt meet secretly after the invasion of the Soviet Union. And they come up with an agreement. And it's called the Atlantic Charter. You need to know it. And they basically kind of say, hey, we're going to help each other out. We'll get into this in a second. But they also start talking about, hey, when we win, this is how we're going to handle this. So they say once the Axis powers are defeated, there's going to be no territorial changes contrary to the wishes of the inhabitants of self-determination. So they're going to keep that self-determination aspect of the Treaty of Versailles. And they called for a permanent system of general security. Well, what am I talking about there? We're talking about the future of the United Nations. Okay, and again, the United States is actively discussing this, and as you know, we didn't participate in the League of Nations, but we are in the United Nations. Stalin endorsed the agreement soon thereafter, and we start to see, Allied forces, mainly the big three. We have FDR, we have Churchill, and we have Stalin. Okay, but meanwhile, this is just talk. We just said we're going to help you guys, but we still remained militarily neutral until December of 1941. And again, even before, in the 1930s, FDR was responsible for passing, and the Congress were responsible for passing the Neutrality Acts, which actually prevented FDR from drawing the United States into the conflict earlier. Probably would have done it, but obviously he waited for Pearl Harbor. Now, the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, what it did was it gave large amounts of money and supplies to help the British and the Soviets. And, again, we weren't fighting, but it effectively ends our official stand in neutrality, okay? And, again, this is a figure of where we were sending goods. Obviously, we're sending goods to Asia to help people thwart out. And again, if you see all around the coast of Africa here in the Middle East, we're helping out in Africa. We're helping out in the Pacific Islands. We're helping out against the Japanese here. We're all over the place with our helping out. Okay. Now, as we already covered, Imperial Japan is on the prowl, and Japan had a large population. We've talked about this. Little food supply, little raw materials for heavy industrial goods. There were large populations, small territory, and they needed food for their people, and they needed raw materials. Now, Emperor Hirohito at this point is basically at the mercy of these right-wing nationalistic military parties, okay? And in 1937, July, Japan invades Manchuria. We've already talked about that. We talked about the United States cutting off sales of iron and oil. And so on December 7th, 1941, a date, ladies and gentlemen, that will live in infamy, the naval and air forces of Japan, attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. It's a premeditated strike. All right. Again, they basically said, we're going to do this. The only thing standing in our way of acquiring what we need is the United States, and they wanted to cripple our authority and our ability to respond, and they did that. Hitler declares war on the United States on December 11th. Remember, the Tripartite Pact, he's an ally of Japan, and that proved to be a fatal blunder. They declared war on us, so when they declare war on us, obviously we declared war on Japan, but instead of focusing on Japan, who attacked the United States, we, along with Britain, would focus on Germany first. The other reason why, if you're wondering why would we do such a thing, well, we needed to help Britain. But the other thing, the attack at Pearl Harbor was pretty significant, and we needed some time to rebuild our fleet. Now, coincidentally, a lot of our aircraft carriers were not docked at Pearl Harbor that day. Thank goodness, because that would have really, put us in a really bad situation. And there's conspiracy theories. Remember, Americans love conspiracy theories. Some people think that FDR knew the attack was coming. That's why they got rid of the aircraft carriers. But anyway, I'm not really into that too much. So you have the alliances, right? Germany, Italy, Japan, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, same old characters. Japan and Italy, ironically, had fought with the Allies in World War I. But, Grand Alliance with the Allies, as you see here, Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, United States, China, and 43 other countries. So, and again, the Grand Alliance agrees to fight until the Axis has surrendered unconditionally. Again, the pledge, you need to know unconditional surrender. The pledge by the Allies to commit to unconditional surrender makes it nearly impossible for Hitler to make deals and divide these allies against one another. So we're almost done, boys and girls. I know it's a little long, but we're getting a lot done here. We're doing this chapter relatively quickly, so hopefully this helps you out. From 1939 to 1942, the Nazis and Japanese seem invincible, okay? However, by 1942, the tide begins to change. And the first turning point I want to talk about is, and I mentioned this earlier, El Alamein in November of 1942. And by November, British forces, led by Bernard Montgomery, drove the Germans, led by Erwin Rommel, a.k.a. the Desert Fox, out of Egypt. all right? And German forces were pushed westward across North Africa. Now, coincidentally, the United States, at the same time, had begun Operation Torch, November of 1942. The United States and British forces landed on the beaches of Morocco and Algeria, engaged in retreating German forces. Rommel's Afrika Corps were surrounded by the Allied armies and defeated by May of 1943. And they were pulled from Africa while suffering mass casualties and prisoners of war. And I think I've already told you, but Rommel would be relieved of his command there, and Hitler put him in another place, and that was defending the Atlantic Wall against a possible British and United States invasion in France, aka Normandy. Okay, so but anyway, really, why did they lose North Africa? Because Hitler's decision to invade the USSR instead of defeating Britain in the Mediterranean now proved disastrous. An Allied victory in North Africa, what did it do? It opened up the door for the invasion of Italy in July, and Mussolini would be dead by 1944. Okay, second big turning point I want to get into is Stalingrad. It's probably the most critical battle on the Eastern Front. It's really the first German land defeat in Europe. Again, Hitler sought to take the industrial city of Stalingrad en route to taking over the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains. German armies were eventually surrounded by Soviet forces, and fierce fighting in the city of Stalingrad. It's a great movie called Stalingrad. If you ever get a chance, good extra credit movie for you guys to do and do a movie review, but included Russian women as participants alongside the Russian men in combat. There was nasty street warfare. It's kind of like urban ops. The street warfare was ridiculous, and the Germans actually called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. And Hitler refused to allow the German forces to surrender, and thus the bulk of the German army in Stalingrad, 300,000 men, was destroyed in battle, just decimated. So once again, just like Napoleon in the early 1800s, Hitler had made the same blunder. After the battle, the Soviets began a 2.5-year campaign of pushing the Germans back to Berlin. In the subsequent Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history, ended in a Russian victory. And by 1945, February, Soviet armies had penetrated to the outskirts of Berlin. Now, the turning points against Japan for the United States, as we were actually involved in a three-front war, two-front here, but by D-Day, a three-front war. The United States destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and established U.S. naval superiority in the Pacific at the Battle of Midway Island. Coincidentally, the United States had cracked the Japanese code, just like the Brits had cracked the Germans, and enabled the Navy to track and meet the Japanese before almost every one of their moves. And America began after this its island hopping crusade and pushing the Japanese back island by island all the way back to mainland Japan. And I've mentioned this earlier, D-Day, one of the most famous incidents in the United States involvement in World War II. It was called Operation Overlord, and it happened on June 6, 1944, where 120,000 troops crossed the English Channel from southern England and invade France in an amphibious assault on Normandy. The success of D-Day demonstrates how important the Battle of Britain had been in 1940 when Germany failed to defeat the Royal Air Force and invaded England. So had the invasion failed, this is one of those instances in history where if it went another way, oh my goodness, who knows what would have happened. But Germany would have been able to concentrate all of its forces against the Soviets on the Eastern Front and possibly could have resulted in a stalemate. So basically, here's D-Day, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, Utah beaches. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you've seen the opening scene, and you've seen what storming the beaches of Normandy were for some of our U.S. soldiers. God bless them. But the significance was, and you need to know this, the Western Front in Europe was established. So now you've got basically Nazi Germany. They got to fight not only a two-front war, but once the Allies go up and liberate Italy, they're going to fight a three-front war, and it basically spells the end, the doom of Nazi domination of Europe. Paris will be liberated 1 month later, And Hitler was fighting on three fronts, as I said. In the east versus the Russians, in the west against the United States, Britain, and France, and in Italy against the United States and Britain. And by the fall, Allied troops will reach the German border, and they are preparing, ladies and gentlemen, for their invasion of Germany, the final push. But Hitler's not done. This is the infamous Battle of the Bulge, December of 1944, and a lot of history for me here. My grandfather was at this battle. It started on my birthday, which happened to also be my grandparents' wedding anniversary, December 16th, 1944. So if you want to hear a little story about the Battle of Bulge, let me know, and I'll tell it to you in class. But this is Hitler's last-ditch offensive to drive the Allies from the western German border, okay? Brutal fighting. If you guys have seen Band of Brothers, Bastogne, these guys, what they saw here is just nobody should see this stuff. But, it was fighting in the dead of winter. It was freezing. Frightening casualties on both sides. And again, we don't need to get into the battle too much here because it's not going to be on the test. But as you can see, the bulge, okay? As the United States and Britain, as they were coming across and going this way into Germany, Hitler led a counteroffensive, okay? And as you can see here, here's the line. Their goal was to bulge the line, push it back, and split. If they could cut the line right here, all right, and split, if they could split that line and break this side of the Allied army from this side of the Allied army, you could possibly have just a stalemate, or you could have decimated right there. The Germans could have possibly decimated possibly the Allied army. But nonetheless, that wasn't the case. Okay, so after his counteroffensive at the Battle of the Bulge fails, the Allies quickly penetrate deep into Germany by 1945. The Americans from the west, the Russians from the east, and both converge on Britain by May of 1945. And as you can see in the two below pictures, the capital, Germany, was in ruins. By May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. Hitler had actually committed suicide a few days later. This picture right here is actually one of the last pictures taken of Adolf Hitler during his last days in his infamous bunker underneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. But again, here's the Soviets taking down the Nazi flag and putting up the communist flag. Okay, and the last years, this is the last slide. And again, I apologize for the length of this, but if you watch this, you are going to be ready for the quiz, okay? So the end of the war for the Americans against Japan occurred in August. Well, the official surrender will be September, but by August of 1945, it's almost over. And rather than face a tremendous, not only United States, it was projected that had we had to invade mainland Japan, okay, we would have lost another 1 million men. Remember, the Japanese were schooled on the samurai culture, and according to the samurai culture, you don't surrender. You die in battle. You fight to the death. And this was ingrained not just in the military, but also the civilians. So, we mentioned some of the atomic theories that were developed in the interwar years and even before World War I. The United States, at the behest of encouragement of Albert Einstein, who knew that the Germans were actually trying to get this technology through the Manhattan Project, had developed the atomic bomb. And with the atomic bomb, after its test out west in New Mexico, when it worked, were delivered. And on August 6th, Hiroshima met the fate of an atomic weapon. And 3 days later, August 9th, Nagasaki. And interestingly enough, these atomic bombs didn't force the immediate surrender of Japan, even though these cities and thousands, tens of thousands of people were instantly killed and evaporated. The Japanese military leadership wasn't going to surrender, as I said, until Emperor Hirohito intervened. Japan surrendered, although the emperor was allowed to remain on the throne. So there you have it. That's the first little bit over half of the chapter. We'll finish it the following night. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions tomorrow before the quiz, please fill out those notes and write those notes and possible questions or areas of concern, and we'll address those. Thanks a lot.